go ahead and try a problem that is similar to number 3 on your TGA. So in this problem, it wants us to graph these two functions and describe the key features. So here I have 1 over x minus 3. So you can see from the graph, or you can tell from the equation, that the domain is going to go to this value of h, right? So it's going to go from negative infinity to positive 3. And then there's going to be a break, and it's going to go from 3 to positive infinity. Okay. So remember, we are looking for a value of k, but remember, if k is 0, the range is going to go from negative infinity to 0, and then from 0 to positive infinity, right? So you can see in the vertical direction, this graph goes up to 0, and then it's kind of, there's a break, and then it goes from 0 to positive infinity. So now let's think about the x-intercepts. So the x-intercepts are actually not going to be there on this function. And the reason is because the x-axis is actually like an asymptote, right? So it's only going to approach the x-axis. So we're actually going to have no x-intercepts. So I'm just going to write none here. And now we want to think about a y-intercept, okay? So the y-intercept, you can actually pretty quickly find it in Desmos. You just have to click on the point where it crosses the y-axis. So you can see here it does that at 0, negative 0.333. So I'm just going to go ahead and write that, 0, negative 0.333, okay? So the asymptotes, remember, we want to think about vertical asymptotes and horizontal asymptotes. So the vertical asymptote, since it's an x minus h, that is actually going to be equal to x equals 3, right? Because remember, it's always x equals h. 3 is the value of h, so we have x equals 3. Since our k value is 0, the horizontal asymptote is going to be y equals 0. Okay, so now let's go over to this function g of x. So g of x is like a little bit different. So it's going to be g of x equals 1 over x minus 3. And then we do plus 4, right? It has the plus 4 on the outside. So now here's our function. So you can see it actually looks a little bit different than the previous one. The domain is once again going to be negative infinity to h. And you can see h is once again 3. So we have negative infinity to h, which is 3. And then from h to positive infinity, right? So 3 to positive infinity. The k value is 4. So the range is going to go from negative infinity to 4. And then from 4 to positive infinity, right? You can see that also on this graph here. So see how it gets really, really close to y equals 4. And then there's a break, and then it goes from 4 to positive infinity. The x-intercept, this graph is going to be different because if we click on the x-axis, you can see that it does have an x-intercept. So that's at 2.750. And then the y-intercept, if we click on that point, it will tell us the coordinates. So it'll be 0, 3.667. And then now let's talk about the asymptotes. Remember, it'll be x equals h for the vertical asymptote. So that'll be x equals 3. And then it'll be y equals k for the horizontal asymptote. So y equals 4. So what you can do now is think about how the plus 4 in the second equation has affected the key features. So some comparisons to note is, like, you can see the domain is the same, right? But look how the range changed, right? The range is different. Before we had no x-intercept, now we actually have one. The y-intercept is also different. And look at how the asymptote changed, right? You can see the horizontal asymptote actually did change, but the vertical asymptote stayed the same.